There is a specific weight that lives in the chest. Not grief. Not quite loneliness. Something quieter than both, and more persistent than either. It is the weight of having reached towards someone and found that the space where they were supposed to be was slightly less solid than you thought. You did not fall. Nothing collapsed dramatically. Nothing announced itself as a loss, but something shifted. Some internal arrangement that you had been trusting quietly, without knowing you were trusting it, moved beneath you in a way that you could not name and could not stop noticing. And here, in whatever quiet you have found in this moment, that shift is still there. It has been there. You carry it through your days and set it down at night and pick it up again in the morning without ever quite deciding to. It sits in the chest, just below language, and it does not ask anything of you. It simply remains. That weight has a particular texture. It is not sharp. It is not the clean pain of something sudden. It is the slow, muffled heaviness of something you saw coming and could not stop. The heaviness of a conversation you replayed at midnight and realized, somewhere between the second and third replay, that you were the only one who had cared about the outcome. That you had gone over the words, rearranged them, looked for what you could have done differently, tried on different versions of yourself in that moment, and all of it had happened entirely inside you. The other person had probably not replayed it at all. The other person had probably already moved on to something else, and what you were left with was not just the weight of the moment itself, but the quieter, stranger weight of wondering whether the caring itself was the problem. Whether the replaying was the problem, whether you were performing some deeply ingrained version of effort that was supposed to produce connection, but had somehow, over and over again, produced the opposite. And underneath that wondering, barely spoken even inside, is the question that everything in this audio is an attempt to answer. Why do the people you invest the most in seem to want you the least? Why does the moment you stop caring change everything? Why does the withdrawal produce what the presence never could? You have felt this. Not once. The pattern has repeated itself enough times that you no longer dismiss it as coincidence. It is a pattern. And patterns have causes. And causes, once understood, can be shifted. But before we reach the understanding, there is something that needs to be said out loud. Because most conversations that begin where this one is beginning will skip past it, will soften it into something easier to receive, and in doing so will rob you of the one thing that actually makes the shift possible. So let it be said plainly. The more you cared, the less you were wanted. Not because something is wrong with them. Not because something is wrong with you. Not because you loved too much, or gave too freely, or were somehow constitutionally excessive in a world that prefers its people at a lower temperature. The answer is not that simple, and it is not that cruel. The real answer is something that most people are never taught, something that sits at the intersection of psychology and nervous system biology and the oldest human intuitions about what draws people toward each other and what pushes them away. The more you cared, and the more visibly you cared, and the more your behavior was organized around that caring, the more clearly you communicated something that you were not trying to communicate at all. And that signal, not your value, not your qualities, not the depth of what you were offering, is what determined how people responded to you. And the difference between understanding that signal and not understanding it is the entire distance between being pursued and being tolerated. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus was born into slavery. He was owned. His body was not his own. The circumstances of his life were determined entirely by forces outside himself, and there was, for most of his early years, nothing he could do about that. And yet he became one of the most studied minds in the ancient world. He became a philosopher whose ideas about freedom were so precise and so penetrating that they were read by emperors and slaves alike, by people whose external circumstances could not have been more different, because what he was describing was something that happened not in the world, but in the self. He wrote that the moment you make your peace contingent on something outside yourself, you have handed your freedom to whatever that thing is. That the desire for external things makes us slaves to those things, regardless of whether we are in chains. That the only truly free person is the one who has located their center inside themselves, rather than in the response of the world to them. He was not writing about relationships. He never mentioned the specific feeling of reaching for someone and finding the space slightly less solid than expected. He was writing about philosophy, about the nature of freedom, about the architecture of the human mind. And yet, read in the context of what you carried into this moment tonight, he was writing about nothing else. You are not broken for wanting to be chosen. The desire for reciprocity is not weakness. It is not a character flaw to be corrected, or a wound to be medicated, or a childishness to be outgrown. It is the most human thing there is. Every person who has ever lived has wanted to be seen and selected and held as someone whose presence in the world made another person glad. That wanting is not the problem. It never was. What was never explained to you, what most people carry to the end of their lives without ever having named it, is that the energy of pursuit does not read as love to the nervous system of the person being pursued. It does not land as devotion or care or the beautiful evidence of how seriously you take the people you choose. It lands as need. And need, however sincere, however generously motivated, activates something in people that looks like withdrawal but is closer to self-protection. Something in the human nervous system reads desperation as danger and reads self-containment as safety. Not because people are cruel, not because the people who moved away from you were defective or incapable of love, but because the wiring is ancient and it does not care about your intentions. It responds to signals. And you have been sending a signal that you did not know you were sending. What this audio is going to walk through, slowly, without shortcuts, without the performance of easy answers, are 14 principles that address that signal at its root. Not tactics, not a script for how to behave differently on the surface while remaining unchanged underneath. Something older than tactics and quieter than performance and more durable than either. The psychology of becoming someone that others move toward on their own. The internal architecture of a person who does not need to pursue because the pursuing flows in the other direction. This is what these 14 laws are about. And they begin not with what to do, but with what to understand. There is a cost to not knowing this. It does not arrive all at once. It does not announce itself in a single catastrophic moment that you can point to and say, that is where it happened. That is the thing that changed everything. It arrives slowly. It accumulates. It is the slow, quiet accumulation of relationships where you gave more than was returned, where you stayed longer than was healthy, where you were the one who always reached, where you were the one who always followed up, where you were the one who restructured your availability around the other person's schedule, softened your preferences to accommodate theirs, swallowed your disappointment to preserve their comfort, and ultimately walked away from the whole thing wondering whether the problem was that you had been too much or not enough. And having walked away with that question, you carried it into the next relationship, or the next friendship, or the next professional dynamic where these same patterns surfaced, and you carried it into the one after that. Not because you were slow to learn, but because the framework you were working from was producing results that looked like confirmation of the wrong conclusion. Every time you reached out and received less in return, some part of you filed that experience away as evidence about yourself, as data about your value, your desirability, your fundamental worthiness of reciprocal investment. And that data, accumulated over years, has been quietly doing something to the way you move in the world, to the way you approach new connections, to the way you negotiate, without even knowing you are negotiating, the terms of your own belonging. It has been eroding something that is harder to rebuild than confidence, harder to restore than optimism. It has been eroding self-trust, the specific kind of self-trust that tells you, without requiring external confirmation, that the way you are reading a situation is accurate, that the way you feel about it is valid, that the way you exist in relation to other people is something you can rely on as a guide. These 14 laws do not argue with the conclusions you have drawn. They do not offer reassurance as a substitute for understanding. They dissolve the conclusions by showing you where they came from, by replacing the framework that produced them with something more accurate, something that, once you have heard it and felt it land somewhere beneath the level of intellectual agreement, begins to reorganize not just how you understand your past, but how you actually behave in real time. In the next conversation, in the next silence, in the next moment when someone you care about steps back and you feel the familiar pull to close the distance. There is a concept in behavioral psychology called intermittent reinforcement. It is the same mechanism that makes certain relationships impossible to leave, even when you know, clearly and articulately, that they are not working. It is the same mechanism that makes slot machines impossible to walk away from. A slot machine that paid out every single time would eventually become boring. A slot machine that never paid out would be abandoned quickly. But a slot machine that pays out sometimes, unpredictably, on a schedule that the brain cannot anticipate or decode, becomes something that the brain cannot stop engaging with. Because the brain is a pattern-seeking machine, and an incomplete pattern is more compelling than a completed one. An uncertain reward is more motivating than a certain one. This concept will return later in this audio in a form that might surprise you. For now, simply hold it. Notice that the most powerful forces in human psychology are almost always the ones that act on you before you become aware that they are acting. This audio is not a list of tactics. A tactic without a genuine internal shift behind it is detectable within minutes to anyone worth attracting. You have felt the difference between someone who is performing confidence and someone who is actually grounded. You have been in the presence of someone who is trying to seem like they do not care and someone who genuinely does not need the outcome. The distinction is felt before it is named. It operates below language, in the register of the nervous system, in the quality of attention and stillness and presence that a person either has or does not have. You cannot fake it. And this audio is not interested in helping you fake it. What it is moving toward is something different, a way of orienting yourself in relation to other people that, once it becomes genuinely available to you, does not require effort to maintain. It becomes the ground you stand on. And from that ground, the dynamics that used to exhaust you simply begin to operate differently. Not because you have changed your behavior, because something underneath the behavior has shifted. And the behavior that flows from that shift is not a technique. It is simply how a person who has found their own ground actually moves through the world. Law 1. The law of internal reference. There is a compass inside you. You were born with it. Every person is. It is not a metaphor for anything mystical or abstract. It is a functional psychological mechanism, the internal capacity to evaluate your own experience, your own choices, your own worth, using criteria that originate inside yourself rather than in the responses you receive from the world around you. And at some point in your development, in a way that was not your fault and that you could not have prevented, that compass was exposed to a field that interfered with its calibration. The field was other people's opinions, other people's reactions, the signal of approval when you did something that pleased the people around you, and the signal of withdrawal when you did not. And over time, through sheer repetition, through the gradual rewiring that happens when any stimulus is paired consistently with a consequence, the compass stopped pointing north. It started pointing toward whatever large object was closest. It started pointing toward whoever was in the room, toward whatever feedback was most recent, toward the temperature of the last interaction as the primary data point for whether you were okay. This is not a character flaw. This is how socialization works. Human beings are social animals in a way that is not casual or optional. The need for belonging, for group acceptance, for the signals that tell us we are included and valued, and not at risk of being cast out, is as biologically fundamental as hunger. The infant who does not successfully elicit caregiving does not survive. The child who cannot read and respond to social signals is at a disadvantage in every environment they will ever inhabit. The adult who has never learned to calibrate their behavior to the responses of others is not a free spirit. They are someone who missed a developmental step. So the learning of social attunement, the development of sensitivity to how others respond to you, is not a mistake. It is how you became capable of functioning in a world made entirely of other people. The mistake, if we are going to call it that, is subtler. It is the gradual shift from using external feedback as information, as one data stream among several, into using it as the primary measurement of self-worth. Into making the question of whether you are okay contingent on whether the last person you interacted with seemed to find you okay. Into waking up in the morning and scanning the memory of the previous day's interactions for evidence of where you stood. Into checking your phone not just to see if someone responded, but to find out what the response means about you. Into spending the hours after a difficult conversation trying to decode what the other person's behavior was telling you about your own value, rather than evaluating the other person's behavior on its own terms. This is what external reference actually looks like in practice. Not dramatic, not easily identified from the outside, just a persistent, low-grade orientation in which the primary instrument for self-assessment is located outside the self. And the problem with this orientation is not that it makes you too sensitive or too dependent or too concerned with what others think, though it does produce all of those things. The deeper problem is structural. A compass that points toward the nearest large object, rather than toward true north, will take you in a different direction depending on where you are standing. Your sense of your own worth will shift based on who you are around. You will feel differently about yourself in the presence of someone who radiates warmth than you do in the presence of someone who is distant. You will feel more solid in relationships where you receive consistent positive feedback, and increasingly hollow in relationships where the feedback is intermittent or withheld. And in the relationships that matter most to you, the ones where your investment is highest, the compass will swing wildly because the stakes are highest and the variance in feedback is greatest, and you will spend enormous amounts of energy trying to stabilize a reading that cannot be stabilized from the outside. Here is the mechanism in its simplest form. When your sense of self-worth is primarily externally referenced, you approach other people with an invisible need. The need is not for what they can give you in the obvious sense, not for their time or attention or affection alone. The need is for their response as confirmation of your worth. And that need, however invisible, is not actually invisible. It broadcasts. It shapes the quality of your presence in ways you cannot entirely control, because it is not a performance. It is a genuine state. The slight overinvestment in how a response is worded, the monitoring of facial expressions for signs of engagement or disengagement, the way conversations that feel important are never quite relaxed, the way you show up with just slightly more than is being asked for, hoping the excess will be met and recognized and returned. All of this is legible to the nervous system of the person you are with, even when they cannot name what they are reading. And what they read, below the level of language, is not generosity, not attentiveness, not care. What they read is need. And need, as has already been said, activates self-protection, not cruelty. The nervous system of the other person is also ancient. It is also running programs that predate the relationship, predate language, predate anything that could be called a conscious choice. And one of those programs reads the particular flavor of attention that comes from external reference as a claim on the self, as a pull that must be resisted or balanced or gotten away from in order to maintain the feeling of autonomy. Now here is the turn. And it is worth holding carefully, because it is the thing that changes everything. There is a particular quality of attention that comes from a person who does not need anything from you, who is genuinely present, genuinely curious, genuinely warm, and yet entirely unattached to how you respond to them, who is not monitoring the conversation for data about their own worth, who is not calibrating their behavior in real time to manage your impression of them, who is simply, purely occupying themselves in the conversation without any secondary agenda running underneath the surface of it. This quality of attention is the rarest thing in human interaction, and it is the most compelling, because the nervous system of the person receiving it recognizes immediately that they are not being needed, and the absence of being needed creates a space in which something like genuine desire can exist. You cannot desire something that is already clinging to you. You can only desire something that has its own center of gravity, and the person whose compass points inward, whose sense of their own worth is not contingent on your response to them, is someone whose center of gravity you can actually feel. You are drawn toward it. Not because they performed anything, because the gravitational field of self-possession is real, and the nervous system that encounters it responds the way it always responds to structural solidity, with approach rather than avoidance. This is where Law 1 leads. Not to indifference, not to the cold performance of not caring, to something much more difficult to construct and much more durable once built, to the genuine internalization of a measurement system that does not require the external world to complete it, to a compass that has been remagnetized, not by willpower, not by deciding to stop caring what people think, but by the slower and more substantial process of building a relationship with yourself that is solid enough to use as a reference point, by developing what the psychologists call an internal locus of evaluation, a place inside yourself that you can actually return to and check and trust. This cannot be performed. It will not work as an affect. You cannot decide to seem internally referenced and produce the same effect, because the nervous system of others reads the difference between genuine self-possession and performed self-possession the way it reads the difference between genuine confidence and compensated insecurity. The reading is not conscious. It does not require analysis. It happens in the first few seconds of contact, and it sets the entire tone of what follows. So the work of Law 1 is not behavioral. It is foundational. It is the work of actually locating your own values, your own preferences, your own judgment, and beginning to treat those things as real, as authoritative, as worth defending not against other people, but for yourself. The work of building an interior that is furnished well enough that you can live in it, that you can come back to it after every interaction and find it waiting for you exactly as you left it, unaffected by whether the interaction went the way you hoped. Almost everything you were taught about being a good person in relationships, about being attentive, responsive, emotionally available, deeply concerned with how others experience you, has been functioning, in part, as an external reference system in disguise. This is not a moral failure. You were not wrong to be attentive. You were not wrong to care. The caring itself was never the problem. The problem was the framework inside which the caring was happening. The framework in which your caring was also, simultaneously, a bid for confirmation, in which your attentiveness was also, simultaneously, a monitoring of the feedback, in which your availability was also, simultaneously, a way of ensuring that the relationship stayed warm enough that you did not have to feel the cold of not being chosen. That is the design problem. And design problems can be addressed. They require not more effort, but different architecture. The quiet turn of Law 1 is this. There is a day coming, not at the end of a dramatic transformation, not after years of disciplined practice, but perhaps sooner than you expect, when you will be in a conversation that matters to you, with a person whose opinion of you has historically reorganized your interior, and you will notice that something is different. Not that you do not care, but that the caring has shifted location. It is no longer in the part of you that is scanning for confirmation. It is in the part of you that is simply present, simply curious, simply itself. And the quality of attention you bring to that conversation will be different from anything you have brought before. Not colder, not more withholding, warmer, actually, more genuinely generous. Because generosity that does not need anything in return is a different substance from generosity that is secretly asking a question. And the person on the other side of that conversation will feel the difference. They will not be able to name it, but they will feel it. And they will begin, without knowing why, to lean in. Law 2. The law of scarcity and presence. Consider water in the desert, not as a metaphor yet, simply as a fact. A traveler who has been moving through heat and distance for days, whose canteen is empty, whose body is registering the specific distress of genuine dehydration, reaches a small spring. The water is ordinary. It is the same molecular composition as the water that flows freely from a faucet in any kitchen in the developed world. There is nothing special about it chemically, nothing elevated about its taste, nothing remarkable about its temperature or clarity. And yet the relationship the traveler has with that water is categorically different from the relationship they have with the water at the tap. The scarcity has not changed the water. It has changed the relationship to the water. And that change in relationship is not a cognitive error. It is the nervous system responding accurately to information about availability. What is rare, the nervous system concludes, must be valuable. What is abundant, the nervous system concludes, can be taken for granted. This is not a flaw in human psychology. It is a feature. For most of human evolutionary history, scarcity was real, and the things that were scarce for a reason, usually because they were genuinely valuable and genuinely difficult to obtain. The berry that was hard to find was harder to find because it grew in conditions that required specific soil and specific light and specific altitude. And those conditions produced something that was genuinely worth the effort of seeking. The nervous system that learned to assign value proportional to difficulty of access had a survival advantage over the nervous system that did not. This wiring persists. It does not ask, in the moment of activation, whether the scarcity is real or manufactured. It responds to the signal. Now bring this into the territory of human connection. When you make yourself maximally available to someone, when you respond immediately to every message, when you rearrange your schedule to accommodate their spontaneous plans, when you are always there, always present, always accessible, always ready, you are sending a signal. The signal is not, I value you. The signal, at the level of the nervous system, is this: there is nothing else in my life that competes with you for my attention. And that signal, however unfair, however disconnected from your actual intentions and actual qualities, reads as something the primitive brain categorizes and files away. It does not categorize it as devotion. It categorizes it as low demand. And low demand, all else equal, is the enemy of desire. This is the mechanism. Availability, divorced from other signals of value, communicates something about your place in your own life. It communicates that you have placed the other person and their access to you above whatever else might reasonably be competing for your time and attention. And the brain of the person receiving this level of availability does not process it as a compliment. It processes it as data. And the data point is, they have nothing more important than me. Which sounds, in the abstract, like a wonderful thing. And yet it does not produce the feeling of being cherished. It produces, slowly, quietly, the feeling of being the largest fish in a small pond. And the largest fish in a small pond eventually becomes curious about other ponds. The evolutionary psychology here is straightforward once named. Every social species operates within hierarchies, and individuals within those hierarchies signal their position through multiple channels, including but not limited to how their time and attention are allocated. An individual whose time is in high demand, who is difficult to access, who has many competing claims on their presence, is signaling, without words, that they are a resource that others consider worth competing for. That signal is read, automatically and pre-consciously, by everyone in that individual's social environment. And the reading produces an adjustment in how they are valued. Not a moral adjustment, not a conscious decision, a felt adjustment. A shift in how desirable and significant their presence feels. Now here is the distinction that changes everything. And it is a distinction that separates Law 2 from a manipulation strategy. Because if all you take from this law is that being harder to reach makes people want you more, you will deploy that insight as a tactic, and the tactic will be detectable, because tactics always are. The distinction is between strategic unavailability and organic scarcity. Strategic unavailability is the decision to wait before responding to a message, to manufacture the appearance of a full life, to perform busyness as a bid for attractiveness. It has a quality that others can feel. There is something slightly off about it, slightly effortful, slightly self-conscious, the way you can always tell when someone is trying to seem relaxed rather than being relaxed. Organic scarcity is something entirely different. It is the natural result of a life that genuinely has things in it that compete for your attention. Interests that are real and absorbing. Friendships that are actual and reciprocal. Work that matters to you and calls for your presence. Practices and pursuits and commitments that are not organized around being attractive to any particular person, but that, in their totality, produce a person whose attention is genuinely in demand from multiple directions. This person is not performing unavailability. They simply are not always available, because their life does not have a vacancy at the center of it that another person's constant access would fill. The uncomfortable truth inside Law 2 is this. The listener, who has been making themselves maximally available to someone they valued, has been communicating, without meaning to, that their life has that vacancy, that the center of their daily experience is, in some sense, empty in a way that this other person's presence could fill. And that communication, however sincere the feeling underneath it, erodes something in how the other person experiences the relationship over time. Not because they are ungrateful or cruel, but because desire requires a particular kind of distance, not the distance of coldness or indifference or game playing. The distance that exists naturally when two people both have full lives that intersect with meaning and pleasure, rather than two people where one has organized their entire life around the intersection itself. How do you build organic scarcity? Not by manufacturing it, by actually building the life that produces it naturally. This is the practical implication of Law 2, and it is also the bridge to a law that comes later in this audio. The law that deals specifically with what a full life actually means and how it is actually constructed. For now, the simpler point. The goal is not to become hard to reach. The goal is to become someone who has something worth reaching for, a life with genuine weight and genuine content, a self that does not have a hollow center that another person is expected to fill. When that life exists, availability regulates itself. You are not always available because you are genuinely occupied, and that genuine occupation is felt by others not as rejection or distance, but as something else, something that activates the part of them that wants to earn something rather than simply receive it. There is a feeling that comes from being with someone who has a full life. It is not the feeling of being competing against. It is the feeling of being in the presence of something that extends beyond you. Of being with a person who has a world that you are being allowed into, rather than a person who is hoping you will agree to become their world. The first creates desire. The second creates pressure. And desire and pressure, despite appearances, are not the same direction. Law 3. The law of the unexplained self. Imagine an iceberg. Not the cliché of it, not the management seminar diagram with the little triangle above the waterline and the vast rectangle below. The actual phenomenology of it. The part you can see is real. It is not a performance. It is genuinely there, solid and cold and present, catching the light, occupying space. And the part beneath the surface is also real, larger, heavier, and it is what makes the visible part possible. The weight below the waterline is not hidden out of strategy. It is simply where most of the mass is. And if you were to transfer the full volume of the iceberg above the surface, it would not float. It would become something different entirely. The iceberg exists as an iceberg, with all the particular qualities of bearing and presence and gravitational solidity that make icebergs what they are, precisely because most of what it is remains below the line. This is not a metaphor about keeping secrets. It is a metaphor about the natural relationship between depth and display. And it points towards something that most people in modern culture have been trained to do exactly wrong. The culture in which most people reading this audio have grown up is a culture that celebrates disclosure. That treats transparency as a virtue, vulnerability as strength, radical self-revelation as the path to connection. And there is truth in this, partial truth, the kind of partial truth that contains within it the seeds of the error it produces when applied without discrimination. Because the full truth is more complicated. The full truth is that openness and compulsive transparency are not the same thing. That genuine vulnerability and the anxious performance of vulnerability are not the same thing. That sharing and oversharing are not distinguished by the amount shared, but by the internal relationship between the person sharing and the sharing itself. When you share something about yourself, because it is genuinely relevant, because the moment calls for it, because the person you are with has earned that level of access through the quality of their presence and the reciprocity of their engagement, the sharing builds something. It creates actual intimacy, the felt sense of being known, of being seen, of having brought something true into a space where it was met with recognition. This is what vulnerability, in its genuine form, produces. And it is precious and real, and not something to be discouraged. When you share because you are anxious about whether the other person finds you interesting, because the silence felt like a judgment that needed to be filled, because you are scanning their face for engagement and deciding to offer more as a bid for it, because you have confused total transparency with trustworthiness, then the sharing does something different. It does not create intimacy. It creates a particular feeling in the other person that they cannot always name. A feeling of something slightly crowded about the interaction, of more being offered than they were equipped to receive, of the relationship having advanced several steps without their full participation in the advancement. And what happens, predictably, is a subtle pullback, not a dramatic one, just a recalibration. The other person takes a half step back to reestablish the distance that felt appropriate, and they do this without knowing why, because the signal that prompted it was below language. Compulsive transparency is almost always driven by the external reference system described in Law 1. It is a bid for validation disguised as openness. You share everything quickly because if the other person knows everything and still chooses you, then you have finally received the confirmation that you were looking for. The total self-disclosure is not actually about connection. It is about certainty, about closing the gap between yourself and the approval you are seeking. And it produces the opposite, because it eliminates the one thing that human attention requires in order to remain engaged: the sense that there is more, that the picture is not yet complete, that the territory has not yet been fully mapped. The human mind is a pattern-seeking, prediction-making machine. It allocates its attention not to what is fully known, but to what is partially known, to what it can almost account for, but not quite, to what keeps producing slight surprises, slight violations of expectation, slight revelations that shift the picture without completing it. This is why the people who are most compelling are not always the most forthcoming. They are the people whose interior you have the sense of glimpsing without fully accessing, whose depth you can feel without being able to chart it, whose next response you anticipate but cannot fully predict. This is not a performance of mystery. It is the natural consequence of having an inner life rich enough that no single conversation could contain it, and being selective enough about what you offer that each offering feels like a genuine gift rather than an anxious filling of silence. The uncomfortable implication of Law 3 is this: in a culture that has elevated radical authenticity to the status of a moral virtue, you may have been trained to experience selective privacy as a form of dishonesty, as if keeping anything back were a kind of deception, as if the truest version of yourself were the one that everything about was immediately available to anyone who expressed interest. This law asks you to consider a different view. That mystery, genuine mystery, the mystery that is not performed but simply lived, is not the enemy of intimacy. It is one of its conditions. That the deepest connections are not built through total disclosure early, but through the gradual, mutual, earned extension of access that happens when two people have demonstrated, over time, that what they offer each other is safe to receive. That the self, which is given freely to anyone who asks, is a self that has not yet determined its own value. And that the self, which is offered selectively, with genuine discrimination about who deserves the deeper territory, is a self that has. There is also something neurological happening here that is worth understanding. The mind naturally leans toward what it cannot fully account for, not because it enjoys confusion, but because an incomplete pattern activates a seeking state, a mild, persistent, motivating state of curiosity, of wanting to know more. The person you cannot quite figure out, whose behavior sometimes surprises you, whose interior you sense is richer than what is being shown, occupies a different kind of space in your mind than the person who has told you everything about themselves in the first 3 hours of knowing them. The first person stays in your thoughts. The second has been processed and filed. The first is an open question. The second is a completed answer. And a mind that is running normally will spend far more time with open questions than with completed answers. You do not owe anyone the map of your interior. Let that land for a moment before you move on from it. You do not owe anyone your history, your fears, your embarrassments, your ambitions, your wounds, your uncertainties, your private understandings of who you are and what you have been through and what you are still working through. These things are yours. They are not currency to be spent on whoever shows curiosity. They are not the price of admission to your presence. They are, at their deepest, the territory of a self that has enough respect for itself to require that access be earned. And the people who deserve access will stay long enough to help you draw the map together. Not because you showed it to them at the beginning, because they were present long enough to warrant it. There is a particular quality of mystery that has nothing to do with holding back. It is the quality of a person who has so much going on inside them, so many genuine interests and genuine questions and genuine processes, that they could talk for hours and still not have conveyed the whole of it. This is not a withholding. This is a fullness. And it is the most magnetic form of mystery there is, because it is not a performance. It is simply what it looks like when a person has been living their interior life with genuine commitment, when they have been curious about the world and about themselves, when they have been reading and thinking and feeling and observing and processing and building something inside that is actually there. That kind of depth is felt before it is displayed, and it does not need to be explained. It simply radiates outward through the quality of a person's presence, the quality of their questions, the quality of the observations they choose to offer, and the ones they choose to keep. And in its presence, people find themselves wanting more without knowing why, because the more is actually there. Law 4. The law of controlled distance. Think about a rubber band. Hold it in your hands. Let one end rest in the palm of your left hand and the other in your right. Now bring both hands toward each other. Watch what happens. The tension disappears. The rubber band goes slack. Whatever pull it had between the 2 points is gone, the moment the 2 points close the distance between them. The rubber band is the same. The material is unchanged. But the dynamic has transformed entirely. There is no longer any pull, because pull requires distance. It requires one end to be held while the other moves. If both ends follow each other, there is nothing. No tension, no elasticity, no force. The thing that made the rubber band interesting, the thing that made it useful and springy and capable of returning to itself, required the space between. Emotional pursuit operates on similar physics. When you feel distance open between yourself and someone you care about, the instinctive response is to close it, to reach, to bridge, to offer something that might repair the gap. And this response is not irrational. In some contexts, in some relationships, it is exactly the right move. When someone you love is in pain, moving toward them is the appropriate and generous impulse. But there is a different situation, one that is much more common in the dynamics that have been exhausting you, in which the distance between you and another person is not created by their pain, but by their ambivalence, by a natural rhythm of engagement and disengagement that every relationship has, by the normal ebb and flow of attention and availability in two people who are both living their own lives. And in that situation, the instinct to immediately close the gap produces something very different from what it intends. When you pursue someone who has created space, what you are communicating in every gesture of pursuit, however small, however well disguised, is that you cannot tolerate the space. That the distance is a problem that requires your immediate attention and correction. That your equilibrium depends on the gap being closed. And that communication, which the other person receives at the level of the nervous system, rather than at the level of conscious interpretation, does two things simultaneously. It confirms to them that they hold something you need, and it removes from them the thing that would have drawn them back naturally, which is the awareness that your attention is something that can be withdrawn, something with its own center of gravity, something that does not simply follow wherever they lead. There is a difference between controlled distance and withholding. It is a distinction worth being precise about, because the confusion between the two is where this law most often becomes a manipulation rather than a genuine return to self. Withholding is about power. It is the deliberate withdrawal of warmth or presence as a mechanism for producing anxiety in the other person. It is punitive, even when it is not experienced consciously as such. It has a quality of calculation about it. Controlled distance is something entirely different. It is a return to your own center. It is the act of redirecting your attention back to yourself, to your own life, your own interests, your own processes, not because you are punishing the other person for creating space, but because your center is actually there, actually waiting for your attention, and because it deserves your presence as much as they do, or more. The specific moments in which controlled distance recalibrates a dynamic are not the moments of conflict. They are not the moments of hurt, where withdrawal would be experienced as retaliation. They are the quiet moments, the ordinary moments when the connection has become slightly one-sided, when you have been reaching a little more than you have been met, when the investment has become slightly asymmetrical in a direction that has not been addressed and does not seem to be shifting on its own. In those moments, the recalibration is not a decision to be less warm or less present or less genuine. It is a decision to redistribute your presence, to give back to yourself some of the attention that has been flowing in one direction without proportional return. To spend an afternoon in your own life rather than monitoring the temperature of another person's. And then to notice, without urgency, what happens in the space that creates. Something in the chest relaxes when you stop reaching. It is not the relaxation of resignation. It is not the emptiness of having given up. It is something quieter and more solid than both. It is what it feels like when you return to your own ground, when you stop leaning forward and let your weight redistribute into your own spine. And that feeling, that specific quality of having come back to yourself, is legible to others. It changes the air around you in ways that are hard to quantify, but impossible to ignore. The person who was previously the one being pursued notices, at the level of the nervous system, that something has shifted, that the hand that was extended toward them has been withdrawn. And if there was anything real in the connection, if there was any genuine interest underneath the dance that had been happening, that withdrawal will activate something. Not always, not with everyone, but with the frequency and consistency that makes it worth understanding as a structural feature of how human desire operates rather than as a tactic with an uncertain success rate. The pull of the rubber band is real, but it only exists when one end holds still. Law 5. The law of non-reaction. Imagine the surface of water. Imagine it in two conditions. In the first condition, something has disturbed it. Perhaps a stone thrown in. Perhaps a wind across it. Perhaps the movement of something through it. The surface is turbulent. It reflects things, but poorly. Shapes that should be clear are broken and multiplied and shimmering. Light scatters from it in ways that obscure rather than reveal. The water itself is the same water. The depth is unchanged. But the surface is communicating its own disturbance rather than the clarity of what it contains. In the second condition, the surface is still. Absolutely, glassily still. And now it reflects with perfect accuracy. The tree on the bank, the sky above, the cloud moving slowly across the blue. All of it rendered with complete fidelity by a surface that has no turbulence of its own, that simply receives and returns what is above it without adding noise. The depth is the same in both conditions. What changed was the surface, and the surface is all that the world can see. This is what emotional reactivity looks like from the outside. Not from your perspective, not from inside the experience of feeling things strongly, which is a real and human and not to be pathologized experience. But from the outside, from the perspective of the person who is watching you respond to events, what they see is the surface. And a turbulent surface, whatever its cause, however justified its turbulence, does not transmit clarity. It transmits noise. It communicates that the stability of your interior is contingent on what is happening around you, that your equilibrium is not yours to hold, that it can be disturbed by events, by behavior, by the responses or non-responses of people around you. And that observation, made automatically and without judgment, produces a particular conclusion in others. The conclusion is about the relative positions. The turbulent surface needs calming. The still surface is already at rest. And in any relationship, in any dynamic between two people, the one who is already at rest has a kind of gravity that the one who needs calming does not. Non-reaction is not indifference. This distinction is essential. Indifference is an absence of feeling. Non-reaction is the presence of feeling held by a stable container. The person who does not react to everything is not a person who does not feel everything. They are a person who has developed, or is developing, the capacity to feel without immediately converting the feeling into behavior, who can hold the full weight of an emotion, can acknowledge it internally, can process it genuinely, without it immediately surfacing as a change in behavior that broadcasts the emotional state to the entire room. This is what is meant by emotional regulation, not the suppression of feeling, but the capacity to feel without being controlled by the feeling, to remain behaviorally stable while internally full. The neuroscience behind this is well established. What is sometimes called the emotional hijack, the takeover of executive function by the fight-or-flight system, produces a predictable cluster of behavioral responses. The voice that rises slightly, the words that come out faster than usual, the face that shows more than the person intended to show, the response that arrives before the thought has been fully completed. These are not signs of authenticity. They are signs of a nervous system that has been overwhelmed. And from the outside, they communicate something that undermines the position of the person experiencing them. They communicate that the situation has more power than the person who can respond, slowly, deliberately, from a still place, who can take time before a response, who can hold a silence where another person would rush to fill it, who can receive a provocation or a disappointment or a surprising piece of information and let it settle before deciding what to do with it. This person is experienced as fundamentally more solid than the one who cannot, not colder. Colder is about the absence of warmth. This is not an absence. This is a presence so grounded that it does not need external events to tell it how to feel. And that quality, that groundedness, is one of the most powerfully attractive qualities a person can have because it communicates something the nervous system of everyone in proximity is looking for. It communicates safety. Not safety in the sense of being protected from harm, but safety in the deeper sense of encountering something that will not be destabilized by the ordinary turbulence of being alive. Something that will still be there, still be itself, still be solid on the other side of difficulty. And there is nothing the human nervous system responds to more positively than that kind of stability. Here is the uncomfortable implication that this law requires you to sit with. Emotional expressiveness and emotional authenticity have been conflated in most people's development. You were likely taught, directly or by example, that showing what you feel when you feel it is the honest thing to do. That managing your emotional expression is something close to dishonesty. That the person who holds back is holding something. That the person who is always transparent about their internal state is the genuine one, the trustworthy one, the real one. And there is enough truth in this to make it sticky. Genuine emotion, genuinely expressed, at genuinely appropriate moments, is real and connecting and human and worth preserving. This law does not argue against it. What it argues against is the reflex of broadcasting every feeling as it arrives. Not because that reflex is dishonest, but because it is not actually what it looks like from the outside. From the outside, the constant broadcast of internal states is not experienced as authenticity. It is experienced as volatility, as emotional weather, as a nervous system that has not found its own ground, and is therefore always responding to the ground around it. And the person who is always responding to the ground around them is not the person who others experience as someone they can rest near. They are the person who needs the room to calm them down. And very few people have the sustained energy and inclination to be someone else's room. Stillness is not armor. That is the final understanding inside Law 5, and it is worth carrying. Armor is a defensive structure. It exists in response to a threat. It is reactive in its origin, even when it appears solid in its effect. Stillness is not a response to anything. It is a posture. The posture of someone who has found, inside themselves, a place that does not require the outer world to be calm in order to remain calm itself. A place that can feel the turbulence of events and remain upright within it. Not unmoved, not unfeeling. Upright. That is the quality that others cannot manufacture in themselves through your presence, but that they can recognize when they encounter it. And when they encounter it, something in them settles. And in the settling, they want to stay near it. Because somewhere beneath the surface of every person is a part of them that has been looking, for longer than they can remember, for something that does not move when they push on it. If the first 5 laws were the complete picture, the work from here would be relatively straightforward. You would become more internally referenced. You would cultivate organic scarcity. You would develop genuine mystery rather than performed transparency. You would practice controlled distance rather than compulsive pursuit. You would build emotional regulation so that your surface could become still enough to reflect clearly. And all of this would work. It does work, in part. The 5 foundation laws describe real mechanisms and produce real shifts when they are genuinely embodied. But there is a specific anomaly that the behavioral framework alone cannot account for. It is the person who does all five and still finds that the fundamental dynamic does not change. Who creates space and observes the space simply remain. Who stops over-explaining and notices that nobody was particularly curious about the explanations anyway. Who holds still and whose stillness is not experienced as depth but as absence. Who learns the first 5 laws and practices them and finds that something underneath is still running the old program, that the root has not changed even when the branches have been pruned. There is a layer beneath the behavioral laws that behaviors alone cannot reach, and the laws that follow are an attempt to reach it. Law 6. The law of the full life. Consider 2 forests. The first was planted. Someone looked at a hillside that was bare and decided it should look like a forest. And so they placed trees at regular intervals in a design that approximated what they imagined a forest should look like. The trees are real trees. They are not fake. They have bark and leaves and roots. But there is something about walking through this forest that is different from walking through the second forest. You can feel the difference from inside it. The spacing is too regular, the variety too curated. The undergrowth is managed. There is a quality of the whole that communicates intentionality in a way that undermines the thing it was intending to create. The second forest grew. Something about the conditions of that hillside, the soil and the rainfall and the light and the particular ecosystem of organisms that established themselves there, produced a forest that no one designed. It has fallen trees that were not removed. It has clearings that appeared not by plan, but by accident of what grew and what did not. It has a quality of being in process, of having its own logic that extends beyond what any single observer could account for. Walking through it, you feel something that you do not feel in the planted forest. Not beauty exactly, or not only beauty. Something more like aliveness. The sense of being in the presence of something that is genuinely doing what it does, because those are the conditions of its existence, not because it was arranged. The most potent form of scarcity is not manufactured. It is the natural byproduct of a life that actually means something to the person living it. A person who has genuine purposes, who has genuine friendships that are reciprocal and deep, who has genuine pursuits that absorb them, who wakes up with something to attend to that is not the management of another person's feelings about them. This person does not need to perform unavailability. They are simply not always available because their life has its own weather, its own demands, its own ecosystem of things that need tending. And when they are available, when they turn their attention toward you, the attention lands differently than the attention of someone who is perpetually available. It lands as something chosen, something drawn from a life that is already full, something that required a genuine allocation of a resource that has other legitimate claims on it. And that quality is felt immediately, the way you feel the difference between a gift that was thought about and a gift that was grabbed at the last moment. The distinction between a life built outward for display and a life built inward from genuine desire is everything. The first is detectable almost immediately by anyone paying attention. It has the quality of the planted forest, the job that was chosen because it sounded impressive. The hobbies that are mentioned before, they are actually practiced. The social life that is described more than it is lived. The person curating the performance of a full life is doing something fundamentally different from the person actually living one, and the nervous system of others reads the difference even when it cannot articulate the reason for the reading. The second, the life built inward from genuine desire, from actual curiosity and actual investment and actual commitment to things that matter to the person for their own sake and not for their signal value, produces something that no performance can replicate. It produces a person who radiates, at the level of how they move and speak and allocate their attention, the particular quality of someone who has somewhere to be when they are not with you. Now the intermittent reinforcement that was planted earlier, that slot machine mechanism, returns here in its most important application. remember the mechanism. The slot machine that pays out every single time becomes boring. The slot machine that never pays out is abandoned. But the slot machine that pays out sometimes, on a schedule that the brain cannot predict or decode, becomes the thing the brain cannot stop engaging with. The incomplete pattern, the uncertain reward, the cycle of presence and absence without a discernible rhythm, activates a seeking state that does not resolve itself because it has no fixed resolution available. The brain keeps returning to it, keeps offering it attention, keeps running the question of when the next reward will come. Not because it has decided to keep doing this, but because the structure of unpredictable reward is one of the few structures powerful enough to override the brain's ordinary efficiency systems. The person with a genuinely full life provides intermittent reinforcement not strategically, but structurally. They are sometimes fully present because they are genuinely present when they are with you, and the quality of their presence is real and warm and attentive. And they are sometimes genuinely elsewhere because their life has genuine elsewhere in it, places and interests and responsibilities that call for their presence in ways that are not manufactured. The rhythm of their availability, therefore, is not constant and not absent, but variable. Sometimes rich and sometimes thin, not on a calculated schedule, but on the natural schedule of a life that has many things in it. And that natural variability, that unpredictable rhythm of presence and absence, is received by the nervous systems of the people around them in exactly the way that intermittent reinforcement is always received. With a pull that does not resolve, with an attention that keeps returning, with a desire to be present when the presence is available, because the presence cannot be taken for granted, because it is not always available, because it is coming from a life that is already full of other things. Do not announce the connection. Simply hold it and feel it land. The uncomfortable implication at the center of Law 6 is this: the listener who has been attempting to be compelling by being available, who has been offering consistent presence as evidence of their investment, may have been waiting for their life to become genuinely full on its own. Waiting for the interests to arrive, for the relationships to deepen, for the purposes to reveal themselves. Waiting, in other words, for the conditions that would make this law applicable to them, rather than actively constructing those conditions. And this law asks the harder question: what would it mean to build that life not as bait, not as strategy, not as a background program running in the service of becoming more attractive to a specific person, but as a genuine project, as the construction, with real commitment and real investment, of a life that you actually want to inhabit. That serves the purposes you actually care about. That connects you to the things and people and ideas and experiences that make you feel, at the end of the day, that you were genuinely present in your own existence rather than waiting at the edge of someone else's. The magnetism that follows from that kind of life is real. It is the most durable form of magnetism there is, but it is a consequence. And it only works as a consequence. The moment it becomes the goal, the forest becomes planted again, and you can feel the difference from inside it. Law 7. The law of selective investment. Hold this image: sunlight and a laser. Both are made of light. Both travel at the same speed and originate from the same fundamental phenomenon, the release of photons, the same basic unit of radiant energy. And yet what they can do could not be more different. Sunlight illuminates everything in its path equally. It falls on the wall, and the chair, and the face, and the book, and the floor with the same even distribution, warming everything, making everything visible, with no particular emphasis and no particular discrimination. The laser does something entirely different with the same substance. It concentrates, narrows, focuses the same kind of energy into a beam so precise and so intense that it can cut through steel, read the information on a disc, communicate across optical fiber at the speed of light, perform surgery. The difference between sunlight and a laser is not a difference in the nature of the light. It is a difference in how the light is directed. Your attention works the same way. And the law of selective investment is about understanding what direction actually means. Here is the social psychology. Human beings in any social environment are constantly, automatically, and unconsciously tracking how they are being treated relative to how others are being treated. This is not a conscious project. It is a background program running at all times, comparing, calibrating, adjusting. When someone treats you with the same warmth and investment they extend to everyone in their environment, the warmth registers at one level. It is pleasant. It is generous. But it does not feel particular. It does not feel like information about you specifically, about what you represent to that person, about whether your presence in their world is something rare or something ordinary. When someone treats you differently from how they treat others, when their warmth toward you is selective, when their attention to you is not something that everyone receives, then the warmth registers at a different level entirely. It arrives as data about your specific position in their world, as evidence that something about you has been noticed, has been evaluated, and has been found worth the particular focus of their best attention. And that is a fundamentally different experience from being on the receiving end of universal generosity. This is the mechanism, and the mechanism has a specific and uncomfortable implication for people who take pride in their warmth and generosity. The person who is kind to everyone, who makes everyone feel seen, who is always available for everyone, who is never too busy to listen, who responds to everyone with the same depth and care. This person is doing something genuinely good. And they are simultaneously communicating something that undermines the signal value of what they are offering. Because if everyone receives it, then receiving it does not mean you are particular. It means you are present. It means you happen to be in the room. And the difference between being chosen and being present is the entire distance between feeling cherished and feeling comfortable. Selective investment is not cruelty. It is not withholding. It is not the performance of coldness toward some in order to elevate the experience of others. What it actually is, when it is genuine, is simply the honest calibration of your attention to what you actually feel. You do not feel the same way about everyone. You are not equally interested in every person you encounter, equally energized by every conversation, equally curious about every story you were told. The investment that is actually selective is selective because your actual investment genuinely varies. Because some people genuinely compel you and others do not. Because your attention has preferences. Because your warmth runs deeper in some directions than others. And when that genuine variation is expressed, when you allow your actual differential of interest and engagement to be visible rather than flattening it into universal niceness, what you are communicating is something that the people on the receiving end of your genuine attention have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting for it. They are receiving not the ambient warmth of a generous person, which is its own thing and has its own value. They are receiving the particular warmth of a person who is actually, specifically, genuinely interested in them. And the difference between those two things is the difference between the sun and the laser. The behaviors that signal indiscriminate investment are specific and recognizable, responding to everyone immediately, never letting anyone wait for a response, always having time, always being enthusiastic about every interaction, asking follow-up questions in every conversation with the same depth and energy, offering the same quality of attention to the person you barely know as to the person you care about most. All of these behaviors, which most people have been trained to view as virtues, are also signals. And what they signal, beneath the level of conscious interpretation, is that there is no filter, that no discrimination is being applied, that the warmth is ambient rather than directed. And ambient warmth, however genuine, does not produce the particular feeling of being chosen. Here is what selective investment actually feels like from the inside. It is the feeling of sitting with someone and giving them your full attention, not performing attention, not doing the things that look like attention, but actually being there in the conversation, with genuine curiosity about this specific person and what they are carrying and what they are discovering and what they care about. It is the feeling of your interest, your real interest, narrowing down to the particular texture of this person's mind and experience, of finding something in them genuinely surprising, or genuinely moving, or genuinely worth thinking about, of offering the version of your attention that you do not offer everyone, because not everyone earns it, and because saving it for the people who do gives it a weight that universal generosity cannot produce. It is the feeling of giving something that cost you something. And the gift that costs something is the gift that is received as extraordinary rather than ordinary. What does it mean to develop genuine selectivity rather than performing it? You do not manufacture it by deciding to be withholding. You develop it by actually having a self with preferences, by actually having standards, not as a performance, but as an honest expression of what you find valuable and what you do not. By actually paying attention to whether the people you are with are giving you something real in return, whether the energy that flows between you is genuine and reciprocal, or whether it is mostly flowing in one direction. By noticing what it feels like to be in the presence of someone who genuinely interests you, and letting that feeling inform how you allocate your warmth rather than allocating it by default to whoever happens to be there. The self that has preferences, that has standards, that has genuine differential responses to different people and different situations, is the self from which selective investment flows naturally, not as a tactic, as an expression. Law 8. The law of unhooking from the outcome. There is a particular quality of attention that is invisible but felt. You have experienced it from the other side. You have been in a conversation with someone who wanted something specific from you, some confirmation, some commitment, some particular response, and you could feel the wanting underneath the surface of everything they said. The questions that were slightly too pointed. The stories that were slightly too shaped toward the desired conclusion. The moments of silence that had a kind of waiting in them rather than a genuine openness. The way every response you gave was being assessed against the desired outcome rather than received for what it actually was. You could not always name what you were feeling in those moments, but you felt something. A low-grade resistance, a slight wariness. The sense of being in a dynamic that was organized not around you, but around what the other person needed you to do. And something in you, automatically and without deliberation, pulled back slightly. Not dramatically. Not in a way you could necessarily justify if asked. Just a half step toward the door. This is what attachment to a specific outcome feels like from the outside. And it is happening all the time in the dynamics that have been exhausting you, happening beneath the surface of the behaviors that feel to you like genuine expression and honest engagement. It is the thing underneath the follow-up text that was framed as a casual check-in. The thing underneath the piece of news mentioned specifically because it would produce a particular reaction. The thing underneath the joke timed to recover warmth after a cooling. The thing underneath the careful wording of the message that was revised 4 times before sending. The outcome attachment is the constant background presence in all of it. And however well disguised the specific behavior, the attachment is what the other person is reading, not the words. The attachment. Here is what the behavioral signatures of outcome attachment actually look like in practice, named as specifically as possible, because recognition is the beginning of change. There is the follow-up message sent 24 hours after something went unanswered, framed as something else, but actually a probe for information about where you stand. There is the casual mention of plans designed to produce evidence of interest or jealousy or desire. There is the performance of not caring, the studied nonchalance, which is one of the most transparent signals available because it is only performed by people who care very much. There is the way certain conversations always seem to circle back toward the same territory, the territory of what they think of you, what they feel for you, whether the thing you are trying to create is actually being created. There is the checking behavior, the return to the message thread, The counting of the minutes since the last response. The cycle of checking and rechecking that is driven entirely by the anxiety of not knowing the outcome. And there is the background presence of the outcome in every interaction, shaping what is said and what is not said, what is offered and what is withheld, from a place of trying to produce a specific response rather than from a place of genuine expression. The fishing metaphor is almost too precise. Imagine checking the line every 30 seconds, standing at the water's edge, holding the rod, and reaching down to pull the line up and inspect it and let it back down, over and over, every half minute, unable to let the line simply rest in the water. Not because you are especially anxious, but because the outcome matters too much to wait for it on its own terms. And the effect of all that checking, all that disturbance of the water, all that agitation of whatever might be moving in the depths toward the hook, is exactly what you would expect. Nothing comes near it. Nothing that lives in the water is drawn toward the perpetual disturbance of the surface. The fish, if there were fish, would have relocated a long time ago. The genuine process of unhooking from the outcome is not the same as pretending not to care. Pretending not to care is still organized around the outcome. It is just organized around it in a different direction, trying to appear not attached while being intensely attached, which is one of the most energetically expensive postures a person can maintain. Genuine unhooking is a reorientation. It is the actual redirecting of attention back toward your own life, toward the things in your life that are not contingent on this particular person's particular response, with enough sincerity and enough sustained commitment that what the other person does gradually becomes not unimportant, but secondary. A thing you would like to go a certain way, but that you are not organized around. A preference rather than a need. A hope rather than a requirement. How is this actually accomplished? Not by deciding to stop caring, which is not within anyone's deliberate control. By giving the caring somewhere else to go. By investing genuine attention in your own life, in the projects and people and ideas that are actually there, actually available, actually able to receive what you put into them. By building, through accumulated evidence, the experience of a life that is full enough that no single outcome is the only outcome that matters. By expanding the territory of what your well-being depends on until the specific outcome that felt so essential begins to occupy its actual proportional space in your life, rather than the inflated space that anxiety assigns to it. The Stoic tradition, running from Epictetus through Marcus Aurelius, and the Zen tradition, running through centuries of practice in an entirely different part of the world, with entirely different language, an entirely different cultural context, an entirely different philosophical framework, arrived at the same conclusion by completely different routes. The suffering in desire is not in the wanting. It is in the grasping. In making your peace contingent on a specific external result. In organizing your inner life around the arrival of something that has not yet arrived and that you cannot control. Both traditions describe, in their own terms, the release that becomes available when the grasping is loosened. Not the release of not wanting, which they also identify as a kind of grasping in reverse, a clinging to non-attachment as its own outcome, but the release of continuing to want while holding the wanting lightly enough that it does not become the weight around which everything else is organized. The uncomfortable implication is the one that requires the most sitting with. You have probably believed, at some level, that caring more would eventually be rewarded. That persistence would eventually produce recognition. That if you maintained the investment long enough, at a high enough level, the asymmetry would eventually resolve itself, and the other person would arrive at the place where the investment was met. This law does not argue with the virtue of caring. Caring is not the problem. It has never been the problem. What this law argues with is the specific strategy of making caring visible as a bid for reciprocity, of signaling the investment as a way of prompting the return. Because that strategy, however sincere the feeling behind it, is not actually caring. It is a transaction wearing the clothes of care. It is offering something with one hand while reaching with the other. And the reaching, however well disguised, is what the other person receives, not the offering. The person who cares without outcome attachment, who gives their warmth and attention and investment without organizing the giving around a specific return, is doing something categorically different. The giving flows from a place that is already full, rather than from a place that is hoping to be filled. And the difference between these two places is felt immediately by the person on the receiving end, who does not know what they are reading, but reads it accurately nonetheless. The giving from fullness does not ask anything. It simply offers. And the offering, because it asks nothing, produces in the recipient the paradoxical experience of wanting to give back. Law 9. The law of self-abandonment costs. Two objects on a table. The first is fixed. It does not move regardless of what happens around it. The chair scrapes past it, and it does not shift. The draft from the window moves across it, and it does not yield. A hand placed against it and pushed finds resistance, finds something that has its own position and does not negotiate that position because of external pressure. The second object moves whenever something touches it. It accommodates every draft. It shifts when the chair comes near. It yields to the hand without resistance, following whatever direction pressure is applied. Both objects occupy the same table. Both are real and solid and present. But only one of them commands a particular kind of attention. Only one of them is built around when the space is being arranged. Only one of them has a position that other things must account for. Every time you abandon your own preferences, your own limits, your own truth, in order to accommodate another person, you communicate one thing with absolute clarity. You communicate that you are less important to yourself than they are to you. And most people, below the level of conscious thought, in the oldest part of the social brain, become less attracted to those who make them feel that powerful. Not because they are consciously seeking power, but because the nervous system reads self-abandonment the way it reads any signal, as information. And the information it extracts is this: this person does not hold their own position. Their position moves when I push on it. And something in the primitive social brain, the part that is running the same programs it ran 100,000 years ago on the savannah, files that information under a category that it does not discuss out loud, but that shapes everything. The category of someone who cannot be fully trusted to hold a position. Someone who is, at some level, not fully formed. Someone whose center of gravity is located in me rather than in themselves. And a person whose center of gravity is located in you produces a particular feeling that is not desire. It is something closer to a mild unease, a sense of responsibility that was not asked for and cannot quite be refused. A weight that is not exactly a burden, but that makes the relationship feel heavier than it should. This pattern almost always develops in childhood, in systems where accommodation was not a choice, but a survival strategy, where the child who adapted to the moods of the room, who read the emotional weather of the adults around them and adjusted themselves to it before anything was explicitly asked, was the child who minimized friction and therefore minimized danger, where saying your own truth was less safe than finding the truth that the room could tolerate and offering that instead, where having preferences of your own was a luxury that the environment could not afford. And so the preferences were submerged not by any conscious decision, but by the simple pressure of what was sustainable. The child who learned to do this was learning something real, something that served a real purpose in that specific environment. The problem is that the strategy persists long after the environment has changed, long after there is no one in the room who requires accommodation in order to remain safe, long after the submerging of preferences has stopped being necessary and started being simply habitual. And it persists because it was never identified as a strategy. It was identified as kindness, as consideration, as care, as what it means to love someone. Here is the full cost of self-abandonment, named in both of its dimensions. The first cost is to the self-abandoner. Every act of self-abandonment, every preference swallowed, every truth softened beyond recognition, every limit crossed because it felt safer to cross it than to hold it, erodes the internal compass described in Law 1. Not in a single dramatic moment, but accumulation by accumulation. Over time, the person who has been practicing self-abandonment consistently develops a particular problem. They stop being able to locate their own preferences. They reach inside for what they actually want and find the question harder to answer than it should be. They discover that the habit of checking what the other person needs before checking what they need has become so ingrained that the second check happens much less often and with much less clarity. The compass that was supposed to point inward has been directed outward for so long that it has lost its calibration. And the result is a person who knows very clearly what other people need and want and feel, and who is increasingly uncertain about what they themselves need and want and feel, which makes them, paradoxically, even more dependent on external feedback for a sense of self, which accelerates the cycle. The second cost is to the relationship. The person who has been accommodating, who has been abandoning their own position in order to preserve warmth, in order to avoid conflict, in order to keep the other person comfortable, has been doing something to the other person's experience of them that they did not intend. They have been gradually erasing themselves from the relationship. They have been making themselves smaller and more accommodating until the thing that the other person is in a relationship with is less and less a fully formed, independently existing human being with their own position and their own preferences and their own occasional resistance, and more a surface that conforms to whatever shape is pressed against it. And while this sounds, in the abstract, like it should feel comfortable and frictionless, what it actually produces is a subtle but persistent erosion of attraction. Because desire, genuine desire, requires another. A fully existing other. Something with its own gravity, its own position. Something that does not simply become whatever you press it toward. You cannot fully desire something that has no shape of its own, because the act of desire requires an object that exists independently of the desiring. And the person who has self-abandoned so consistently that they no longer have a shape of their own is, in the most precise sense, not there to be desired. Here is the connection that runs underneath everything the first four laws described: external reference, compulsive availability, over-disclosure, pursuit behavior, the impulse to immediately close every gap, to never let any distance stand, to always be the one reaching. All of these behaviors are expressions of the same root mechanism. They are all forms of self-abandonment. They all prioritize the other person's experience of the relationship over the self's own integrity within it. They all involve, in one way or another, the subordination of the internal compass to the external reading. And this is why modifying the behaviors one by one, without reaching the root, produces results that are temporary and unstable. You can decide to create more space and find that you create space anxiously, in a way that is still organized around the other person's response to the space. You can decide to stop over-explaining and find that the silence is still a bid for curiosity rather than a genuine comfort with the unexplained. The behaviors change, but the root runs underneath them and eventually reasserts itself in new forms. Law 9 is the invitation to go to the root. What does it feel like to hold your own position? Not aggressively, not as a performance of stubbornness or a demonstration of dominance. Simply to hold it, to have a view and let it be your view, to have a preference and let it matter, to encounter a push from someone you care about and feel the push land and feel your own position remain where it was, not because you are refusing to be influenced, but because the position is genuinely yours and you have decided, or are learning to decide, that your genuinely held positions deserve the same respect from you that you extend to other people's genuinely held positions. To feel the familiar pull toward accommodation and choose, this time, to stay where you are. Not to fight. Just to remain. There is a stillness in that remaining that is different from every other stillness described in this audio. It is not the stillness of non-reaction, though it is related to it. It is the stillness of a person who has found their own ground and is standing on it. Who does not need to be moved in order to prove they are listening? Who can hear a challenge to their position, receive it fully, consider it genuinely, and still remain in the place they were standing when the challenge arrived. This is not rigidity. Rigidity refuses to be influenced even when influence is appropriate. This is something more like integrity of self, the experience of remaining recognizably yourself across the changing pressures of a relationship. And it is felt by the person on the other side of it as something they did not know they were looking for, as the specific quality of solidity that makes it possible to rest near someone rather than simply revolving around them. Because you cannot rest near something that moves whenever you move. You can only rest near something that holds.